everyone, welcome to the channel. My name is Nader. In this video, we're going to wrap up our Pokemon project finally after looking at kind of the requirements, looking at how we can actually build out the prompts in the previous video, and now finally actually saving the files, specifically the stats file as well as the image files like for the sprites and for the artwork once we reach out to the Pokemon API and ask for that information. So this video is going to be all about kind of that last process right there, as well as actually putting everything together finally to kind of complete the entire application from start to end and finish out our actual program loop. So let's just get right to the project. Okay, so in the previous video, we kind of started over here, and I have the code up and we'll kind of go through it together. If you don't have the code, feel free to take a look at the GitHub link in the description. It should be in there. So we did a kind of the prompts for this part, not really the actual doing yet, but we asked the user for the Pokemon they want to look for and whether they want to choose stats, sprites, or artwork, right? So if I pull up my code over here, this is our prompts file from before. And if I run node and I run prompts.js, it's going to execute this function right over here, prompt user, which we wrote, which is this infinite loop. And it's going to ask us for the name. For example, I can say Mew, and then I have some logging going on. I guess I can get rid of that later. And then I can move up and down and I can choose different fields here, for example, stats and artwork, and I press enter to proceed and I get those values back out, which is fantastic. And then I can search for another Pokemon if I want and enter the loop, or I can just quit out of the loop, right? So that's what we did last video. This time we're actually going to kind of add the functionality to that so that we can actually get the information back and saved to our actual computer. So I have a whole bunch of code here on my other screen. I'm going to try to go through it in a process that makes sense. But just to recap how this actually works, this is our process, right? We are here running our node file and we're asking for a Pokemon. I asked for Mew just now, but we can ask for Pikachu or any Pokemon that exists inside of this API. Right? It just has to actually exist. We're sending a request over the internet. We're talking to the API. The API is going to check if that Pokemon exists and return back to us this JSON with that Pokemon information. And then we can actually grab that on the front end and we can log it out. So over here, for example, was that exact process inside our fetch Pokemon where we're reaching out to the API, grabbing that response, grabbing the JSON, parsing it out, and then returning the JSON so that we can actually use it over here, right? And that's why we saw for example, I think this was the Pokemon weight right here being logged out, as well as the Pokemon name, and this is coming from the API, right? So that was pretty cool. So now, if we kind of go back to how we broke down this process, we kind of went through these parts here, as well as fetching the Pokemon in the last part of the video, which is that function I just showed you, right? So we did all the setup, we did all the prompting, which you just saw with the command line there, and then the actual fetching, which grabs that information. Now in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to grab specific Pokemon information, right? So if you think about the requirements, we ask for stats, sprites, and artwork to be prompted, but we're not actually grabbing that information specifically. Now, technically it's in there. However, we're going to see how we're actually going to need a little bit more information and maybe other subsequent fetches in order to actually get more data back into our computer. So we need to kind of do that process, fetch more information regarding the images and maybe the stats. We'll take a look at that. And the crux of this video, the real hard part, I guess you could say, of this video is going to be trying to figure out how we save data to our file system, to our disk on our computer. We're going to do this in two ways. One is the easier one, which is using a text file, right, which is going to be our stats.txt right here. And then the second thing is going to be the images, which is going to be a bit more complicated, where we're going to have to save the sprites as well as save the actual artwork image, right? And then finally, we can just kind of tie all this together at the very end into our game, not game loop, I guess, into our command line loop. Usually it's game loops that run in the background for a lot of this stuff. That's why I keep saying game loop. So over here, what we have is breaking down a little bit each of these processes a little bit further, just so we can kind of see how we can actually work on each individual component of this, right? Because this is still a little bit vague. This is a bit vague. This is a bit vague, right? So for fetching specific Pokemon information, well, we need to fetch three types of information, right? We need to fetch the stats, technically we see that we'll already have done this. So we actually kind of solved this one, but we can maybe pull out that stat information a bit better. Then we want to fetch the artwork, which we haven't really done yet, and then fetching the actual sprites, in which there was, I believe, 4 to 8 of them. Okay, so we need to kind of solve this. Then we need to kind of figure out how to get that saved to our computer, right? So we want to create a folder to actually save the Pokemon name. So for example, I'm looking for Pikachu. I want to create a Pikachu folder and put all Pikachu's information for their stats and their images inside of that Pikachu folder. Because if we don't do this and we search for multiple Pokemon, what's going to end up happening is we're going to get a very cluttered folder, and we're going to have like kind of all these files all over the place. We might accidentally also overwrite files if we're not organizing it by folder and by Pokemon. So the text file there is one of the things we need to learn. We need to learn how to create a folder, as well as how to save an image file to our computer. Okay. And then finally, we want to kind of complete this all and tie it all together with a loop. So let's start tackling these one at a time. So if I pull up my code over here, we kind of can assume that we've finished our prompts for now. Okay, so just to recap this, we have fetch and inquire, which is our command line prompter, which is giving us all these fancy looking prompts over here in our command line. But we have the prompting for the Pokemon name, which is this one right here. We have prompting for the download information, which is the stats, sprites, and artwork, which is what we see over here. And I only picked 2 in this case. Prompting to continue, which is this yes or no thing right here. And I click no. And then fetching our Pokemon information and then kind of tying these above features together and running that code, right? That's what we did previously. So in our new kind of mindset of actually approaching this from a saving perspective, I'm just going to kind of create a file here on the left-hand side. I'm just going to call this saving.js for now. You can rename it. Doesn't really matter what you call this, as long as you're consistent with your naming and you remember what you named each file. We only have 2 files, or maybe 3 in this case when we wrap this up, so it's not going to matter too much. Just make sure it makes sense to you what you're naming these files, right? If I think of this, this is the prompts. If I think of saving, maybe it's like saving stuff to the file system. Maybe there's a better name you can use. Let's just go with really simple language for now. All right, so for saving, I'm just going to kind of pull in some imports that I know I'm going to need. And we're going to look at how this is going to get tied together, specifically with creating a folder to start, because I want to actually, I just realized that I said I want to do this first, but I kind of need to cheat a little bit. I actually want to be able to create a folder first, because I don't actually want to fetch information yet. Until I have a folder to kind of put that information in, right? So I just want to see if I can get this create folder working first. Let's see if that actually can work for us. So there's a lot of ways to do this in Node. And again, this is specifically a Node.js thing. This is not a browser thing. So what we're doing right now would not work in the browser. So like in Chrome, Firefox, Safari, it would not work there. This is only working inside of Node.js, okay? So let's go ahead and import some of these modules. So if we take a look back here at our requirements, I mentioned that we want these 2 modules right here. So import fs from fs promises, and then import path from path. And we don't know what those are yet, but let's just kind of just assume for now. I gave you a bit of a hint that we're going to need these just to make our lives a little bit easier. So from fs promises, and then import path from path. There we go. All right. So I'm going to pull up Google and I search create a folder in Node.js. Simple, all right? How to create a folder if it doesn't exist in Node.js. Perfect. So there's a whole bunch of these kind of Google links here we can look at, Stack Overflow. And interesting that the Node documentation doesn't pop up. They should probably up their SEO game here a little bit. But I'll just pull up this Stack Overflow article here. Why not? Zoom in a little bit. I want to create an article, readable, sure. FS, okay, here we go. We have FS. We have the directory, okay. We want to say if FS exists sync. Okay, so this is interesting. So we're actually able to do this in 2 ways, synchronously and asynchronously. I mentioned that I wanted to use FS promises, which is the async version. So I'm actually going to need to figure out how to do this with FS promises, not just the FS by itself, which is not with promises, just synchronously. I'm going to scroll down here, see if I can find anything about FS promises. And not really. They're all doing this synchronously, which is fine. It's just a different version of what we're doing. You know what? I'm just going to go back to Google and I'm going to say, I'm going to maybe go with create async. Maybe I'll just add async to the end there, right? Async creating folder in Node.js, another Stack Overflow, everyone's favorite. Scroll down a little bit. Okay, so we have promises.makedir, make directory. I'm assuming that means make directory, and then we give it a path. Okay, interesting. So that will hopefully work. Now, I do want to mention something here, and I do not expect you to have done this yourself, but I want to kind of bring it up just for something that you can think of when you want to make more robust applications. You see how this example uses the forward slashes when they're creating a directory. Now, technically speaking, I believe this command actually might deal with kind of making these directories beforehand using a bunch of crazy logic in there to figure out what operating system we're on. Basically, if we're on Windows, you might notice that your file system kind of uses the backslash. If you're on Mac or Linux, it uses this forward slash. So I think it handles that, but let's just see how to handle this if it didn't handle that. We want to be able to create these slashes or these folder separators kind of dynamically depending on the operating system that the user is using, right? So if I did this maybe on a Windows, if this function wasn't set up correctly, maybe it is, but just assuming the function wasn't set up correctly, it would probably crash because we're giving it the wrong slashes, right? So I'm just going to kind of Google Node.js. I'm going to say like path separator, for example. That's all I can really think of. Oh, yeah, here we go. Look at this. Same question that we do. How do you determine the OS separator in JavaScript? Scroll down, use the path module, and it returns a platform-specific file separator. So you can use path.sep, right? And it will give you the slash, and we had to require path, right? So in this case, we imported path, but it looks like we can just try out this path.sep. So you know what? I'm going to try this out. I'm just going to do a console log. This is what I love to do once I look at documentation for things. I'm going to say path dot, and I'm going to do sep. All right, so in theory, what I should get if I run node and then my saving.js is I'm on a Mac, so I should get the forward slash, right? And if I do that, I get the forward slash. So if you run this on a PC, you might get the backslash, right? And that's because the separator is different depending on which type of file system that you're on. You can see my entire folder structure right here is all forward slashes. For you, it might look like backslashes if you're on Windows. All right, cool. So then what we want to do is create a folder path. And now I've done this a few times, so I'm cheating a little bit because I'm kind of jumping ahead here. But let's just see what happens here. Let's say Node.js create folder path. How do you create a directory if it doesn't exist? I think we saw that one there before. How do you create a directory? Let's just go with this one again, see what they did. I think they did just the here. Okay, I don't want to do that one. I want to show you another way to do this. Scroll down a little bit. Path.resolve, very similar to this kind of thing, except we actually want to use path.join. Okay, it's not in here. You can see that's a lot of Googling, right? Like I have not kind of planned these Stack Overflow articles. I'm just Googling it kind of as we go just to show you what this would be like. But here they have a separator. They're doing some stuff in here. Path.resolve. Okay, so this looks like a path.resolve might be some kind of thing. Is there anything else we can use? These look kind of complicated, these examples. That's using a different directory structure. This is using path.something else, path.split. Not really sure what that is. Some of these are pretty old, by the way. So if you look at these, they're talking about like Node 10 and older Node versions. So you would hope that we would create something a bit better since then to create these directories and a bit easier to understand. So I think it's suffice to say that I actually Googled for this for a while, and I always end up doing that when kind of looking through these. And I ended up getting something like this. So I said create folder path join is what I ended up actually using. And if I go to their documentation, oh my goodness, that's so small. If I go to path.join here, what this is going to do is it joins all the given path segments together for using the platform specific separator as a delimiter. So that's nice. So this does basically the path.sep thing for us automatically. Okay, so for example, if we do path.join and then we try to join all these things together, we can even do relative directories, which is pretty awesome. We'll actually get the full path back. Okay, so why am I kind of telling you all this, right? Well, I want to kind of play around with this a little bit. So if I say, I want to be able to create a folder, but in this current directory, right? That's the goal. Let's see how we can do that. So if I say fs.makedir, and this is going to take a path. So let's just say I ignore kind of everything that we just looked at, and I want to do in the current folders like / and I'm just going to say test, right? Let's see what happens. So I want to see if a test folder shows up here. So I'm going to run my node savings, and it looks like it did, right? Test folder actually got created. So that's pretty great. That works pretty nicely. Now the question is, will this work on other operating systems, right? Like if I try to do let's say /, or I guess technically if I wanted a full path with something like this, if I did like / something and then / something else, right? Maybe this would break. So I just want to show you a bit of a more robust way to actually create these. And I'm going to create a function to do this. So I'm going to say const create folder. It's going to be an async function. It's going to take a folder name. And in here, we want to create a folder, but only if it doesn't exist already. So what I want to show you is if I try to run this one more time, take a look at this, right? If I run trying to create this test one more time, I'm going to get an error. File already exists, make directory test, right? So I can't do this. I want to be able to make a directory one time, and if it exists, I kind of just want to ignore it. So I need to also figure out how do I check to see if this directory actually exists already? Because I don't want to run this command and have an error out and break my program if it already exists, right? So for example, you can imagine if someone checks for mu and the mu folder gets created and they only choose stats, but then they run it again and then they choose artwork, we should allow that functionality, right? We shouldn't just have it break or delete everything in there previously or things like that. We want to check to see if the folder exists simply, and then actually use the folder if it already does exist, right? So let's Google for that as well. So we kind of have this path stuff going here. It's interesting. So NodeJS fs promises check if folder exists. Check synchronously. No, I literally said promises. Google. I literally said promises. Okay, so let's go over here. fs_stat. fs access, interesting. You can do it synchronously via exist sync. Okay, so we don't want to do that. Or you can do it with a try catch asynchronously like this. Okay, interesting. So we can basically create a try catch in our code to test this out. So let's just do this. So since this is a module, we can actually do this in the top level without using an async function. So let's see how this actually works. So I want to be able to create this directory, right? So I want to. So they're saying if I can access the path, then it's succeeded. Otherwise, it's failed. Okay. So what does that mean? That means like if I can access that, that means that that folder exists, right? So if I say fs.access is what they're saying, await. And I don't need to do .promises here, right? If you think about it, because I already have promises imported. So if I say fs.access, they're saying that it's going to succeed in the case that it exists, and it's going to fail in the case where it doesn't exist, is what I'm thinking it's saying there. So if I paste that code in here that I had previously, I'm going to say, if I come down here, then the folder exists. But if I come into the catch, the folder doesn't exist. That's how I'm interpreting this. Doesn't exist. Okay, so this is a lot of jumping around, right? You can probably even see me. I've done this already. I have the code over here, and I'm still jumping around, right? I want to do some path stuff. I want to do some folder check-in, right? This is generally kind of the structure that you'll go with when you're building these things, especially if you don't know for the first time. Let's see if this works. So I have my test folder. I'm going to try to create it, but only if it doesn't exist according to this code, so I don't get an error. And okay, that worked, right? It looks like we actually created this correctly. So now if I change this to, for example, test2, I want to see if test2 exists. Otherwise, create it if it doesn't. Let's see what happens here. And there we go, test2. All right, fantastic, cool. So that's pretty nice. It's a bit clunky, right? This is a bit kind of clunky. I'm not really a fan, but let's put this in here. So create folder, and that goes in here. All right, so now the issue is we got to kind of change this. This is no longer hard-coded, right? So I can take this folder name, oops, I can take this folder name and I can put it in here, and I can take the folder name and I can put it in here, right? So that kind of works. So I can say, like, for example, create folder, and I can say like test3, right? And now let's see if that works. And there we go, test3 is in there. All right, so that's cool. But now I wanted to say that I wanted to create a file system agnostic way of actually doing this, right? So I'm going to do this. I'm going to say const folder path is equal to. Now, what you'll see is a lot of code will, not all node code will use this kind of thing, and this is creating a file path. And technically, this is fine in the case of us running this code from this folder, but there's other cases where we could run our code from other folders, and we want to make sure that it's always being created in this folder, I guess, in this case, is how we want to approach it. We don't want this folder to be created in other folders just because you're creating or running the script from another folder. So we want to grab the folder that the current JavaScript file is running in. So let's check that. If I go back to Google and I say node get current folder or current directory, it looks like that's the top result. How do we get the current, the path to current script in Node.js? It looks like people are saying either __ file name __ dir name. I don't really want the current script. I want current directory. Looks like cwd path.base name process.cwd. Okay, so what is this cwd thing? So you know what? I'm just going to log this out here. I'm going to say console.log. What did they say? Process.cwd, current working directory. So if I hover over this, method returns a current working directory of the node process. Okay, interesting. I run this. All right, there we go. So I have the current directory. So this is my code. Cool. So if I kind of go up a folder and I run from the code folder, I run my savings. Now I'm in this folder, right? So that's kind of giving me the directory that I'm running this command from, which is kind of nice. I hope that came across on the stream. Let me just kind of go one more time. If I go up a folder and I run node code and then saving.js, we actually get the full path. But then if I go into my code folder and I run node saving.js, now I have the code folder at the end, right? So this is just giving us which folder we're running the script from, effectively. This looks like this current working directory. So the folder path, what we can do is we can do path.join, and this is going to join up different paths together. So I can join up my process.cwd here, and I can just give it the folder name. So I'm going to always say when you're running the script from any folder, I'm going to figure out what folder you're running the script from and create this Pikachu folder, for example, inside of the folder that you're running the script from, right? Otherwise, all these will be hidden inside of here, and that may or may not what we want to happen. We could probably allow command line arguments or something to, or even ask the user what they want, and do different scenarios where do you want it to save it in one place or do you want to save it in your current folder? But for now, let's just keep it simple and just do it in the folder that they're running in. So I'm just going to take this, I'm going to change this to folder path. And that should be good. So this is grabbing the path to where the script is being run. Now, the previous example would have also worked fine. You don't actually have to go as far as this. I just want to show you a little bit fancier how we can actually get that working. We're going to use this path.sep shortly, so just keep that at the back of your mind as well. It's just fun to learn these new functions as we go along because working in the file system is a very useful thing to know how to do. Perfect. Now, let's figure out what to do with the next part of our code. So if we kind of come back here, we are able to create folders, right? So that seems to work just fine. So now let me just test this one more time and create folder, create for. And there we go, test 4 is being created. If I do it one more time, nothing happens, which is great. We don't get an error. Perfect. So this is working. Now, the next thing we want to do is figure out how to actually get back the stats and save it to our file, right? So let's kind of take a stab at that before we actually get to the saving the images, because we're going to create some helper functions for this as well to make our lives a little bit easier. So for Pokemon stats, I'm going to get rid of this right now. I'm also going to get rid of these for now, or just comment them out at least, so we can refer to them later. So let's just assume create folder is done. I'm going to minimize that. Now what I want to do is I want to create a save Pokemon stats function. This is going to be an async function, and this is going to take the Pokemon stats object. Now, why did I do it this way, right? The reason I'm creating a function that is going to take an object as an argument is because I want to make this function a bit more robust. I want to be able to create something where if you give me the stats object, I will just kind of save it for you, right? And in this case, we don't want to deal with mixing too many concerns. So this is actually part of why we're doing these exercises and projects. It's not only to get the answer, of course, it's nice to see a running program, but also to see some patterns as to how you can start thinking about code and thinking about structuring your functions. Now, we could do a couple of things here. In fact, we could do an infinite amount of things, but we could really do this two huge ways. One is we could create a function that goes out and fetches the Pokemon, comes back, and then saves all the Pokemon stats to the disk, right? We could definitely do that. What I want to do, though, is split up that functionality. I want to be able to create one function that fetches the stuff and another function that's only job is to save the stuff, right? So I'm really modularizing out this code so that I know each thing is responsible for one specific behavior. This really is going to help us later on when we try to figure out how to debug this, or if there's issues with specific parts of our code, or we even just want to add functionality or modify it in the future. Or if we're working on a team and you have very modularized functions without going too extreme, it really does help people to trace the flow of logic and figure out where to actually go if they need to change something, add a new feature, or maybe even fix a bug. All right, so let's assume we have the stats object. So what is the stats object, right? That's really the first question. So let's go back to Google, and I'm just going to go back here, and I'm going to search for Pokemon API. And I'm going to go to pokeapi.co. And if I zoom in here, let's look at Ditto, for example. We get back this object right here. Okay, so I'm going to minimize all of these. I really wish they had a minimize all button, but that's okay. So we get all these back when we search for a Pokemon, right? And if I search for example, Mew, these all are the same keys, but just different values. All right, so stats, specifically stats. Let's take a look. That's probably going to be in the stats key, okay? This one right here, I'm assuming. All right, so it looks like there is an array of 6 items, and inside of this array are objects, all right? And in those objects, we have base stat, we have effort, then we have another key, which is also an object called stat, which has the name of the stat and then maybe a URL, whatever that is. All right. So our goal is to basically display like HP 100 and then attack 100, right? So if I search for maybe Mewtwo, for example, slightly different statistics here, HP is 106, attack is 110, right? Defense is 90. So I'm going to assume that our function gets this array. I should have really called it stats array, but I called it stats object, okay? Because it's coming from this bigger object. So we're going to assume we get this array, okay? So we want to effectively do what? Let's think about this. We want to loop through each of these stats, and we want to, for each stat, save it on a line with the stat name and then the stat value, okay? And then we want to create a new line and then do that for each stat. All right, so let's kind of just tackle this one at a time. So let's assume we're getting this object, which really is an array, right? This object is actually this array right here. So we're going to loop through every single stat in that stat array. So I'm going to say for const stat of, this is a for of loop, right? So let's just assume that this is going to work with a array. So now we're going to grab each stat. So I'm going to say console.log, and I'm going to say console.log that stat. Okay, so this would probably work. Let's think about this. So if I want to make this work, let's just say for now, I'm going to grab this code for fetch Pokemon in our prompts, and I'm going to actually just for now, I'll just get rid of this prompt user, and I'm going to just create an export, and I'll say export fetch Pokemon. We're not actually going to use this, I think, right away in this file. We're going to use it inside prompts, but let's just do this for now just to get some practice with ES modules as well. So I'm going to say import something from /prompts. And what do I want to import? Well, that's going to be the fetch Pokemon, right? So let's just say for now, I want to say const Pokemon is equal to await fetch Pokemon, and I want to fetch, let's just say Mewtwo. All right. And I then want to be able to call save Pokemon stats. And again, I can do this only in an ES module with this top level awaits, right? So it's definitely handy in cases like this to test out our code. Otherwise, we need to make a wrapper function to do await, or we could just use .then on this, right? So save Pokemon stats, and I'm going to give it the Pokemon, I guess I'll just call this Pokemon, Pokemon object. And in this case, this is the entire Pokemon object. Right? So if we come back here, we're grabbing this entire object, but we want to just pass stats, which is the array, to this function, right? To this function right here. So we get back the whole stats, which we're going to use other things in there later, but we just want to grab the stats object out of it. So I'm going to do .stats. All right. Then it's going to come in here, and we're going to log out each of those stats in that array, basically. So what we expect to see is not really the stats. We expect to see each of these values, right? Each of these objects is what we're going to see, right? Each of these objects kind of in that stats object for Mewtwo. So if I run saving.js, I get an error, cannot find module, what is this, prompts. So this is a good use case here. We always have to add our extension .js. I always forget to do that. We have to let ES modules know what kind of extensions our files have. So node saving.js. I know the scroll is a little bit past my screen, but you can kind of see that we do have all the stats coming through here, right? So here's our base stat, and then inside of there we have our nested HP. Here's another base stat. We have our nested attack, etc., etc. So what we want to do is we want to actually grab these stats out, right? So let's think about this. We want to basically build up a string and save that string to the file kind of as one big chunk. So let's try this out before we do any saving. So I'm going to say let stats string start off as an empty string. And I'm going to just start adding to this string the stats one at a time. I'm going to try to space them out. And then as we finish this function, hopefully we have all the stats listed out in one go. So let's do this. I'm going to say stats string. I'm going to concatenate to it, so plus equals. I'm going to use a template string here. So what do I want? I want the stat name followed by the stat value. So in here, I have the stat name is under stats.stat.name, right? So this whole thing is stat, which I named right here. You could probably name it differently, but .stat.name is what we have. Okay, so I'm going to say stat.stat.name, and then I'm going to put a space. Actually, let's do colon too. And then I'm going to do another thing here, which is going to be the stat.baseStat, right? Which is this value right here. So instead of calling it value, they called it base stat. All right. So then I'm going to console.log out this stats string. Let's see what we get. Run this one more time, and we get back interesting. So we get back this whole object, right? So that's pretty cool. Look at that, right? We have all of our stats. It's a little bit wonky looking. Because we're missing like spaces or new lines. So let's Google that, right? Yeah, how do we do a new line? Like new line JavaScript string. How how do you add a new line? JavaScript string. There we go. Stack Overflow. We have, oh my goodness, this is so complicated. What is this? I just want a new line, people. Yes, it's universal. Universal, okay. It looks like people are saying this \n, there's this \r. People are saying use both. Don't use, okay, so you can say also like literally create a new line like that. You know what? I'm just going to try the \n for now because we're not dealing with HTML. So people are saying if you're not using HTML, just use \n for now. So I'll just go with that. So I'm going to put a \n here, which is going to say put a new line, hopefully at the end of the string. Try this one more time. There we go. All right. So this is not a file yet, right? But we have a string. We have some text that we can save to the file. So let's do that next. So how do we save a text file in Node.js? So I'm going to come back to Google. I'm going to say Node.js save text file. How do you write a file in Node.js? fs.write file name, and then data. Okay. I think we're using promises. So fs text file, fs promises. Let's do this. Writing file promises. There we go. Maybe some stuff over here. We can do await fs.read file. We want to read await fs.write file. Okay, good. There we go. So we have fs.write file, file name.txt, and then test. In this case, that's the string they want to write. Okay, cool. So we want to write our stats string to the file, and then we want to write the name of the file in here. Okay, so I'm going to come back to VS Code. So here's the tricky thing. When we're creating this write file, we need to actually give it an entire file path, right? Very similar to when we created the create folder here. We effectively need to do something like this, right? So we can do this a couple of ways, but really what we want to do is save it to the Pokemon name directory, right? And we want to assume that that's in the current directory. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to actually create another parameter here for this function. And there's many ways to do this. In fact, looking back at this code, this probably wasn't the best way to do it. It's just one possible way to do this. I want to say to this function, hey, what folder do you want to save this file in? Just so I don't have to worry about that. So I'm going to say folder name as a parameter. So when you call save Pokemon stats, you have to give it a folder name. You can't just call it by itself because it needs to know where to save that file. All right. So then what we want to do is we want to create the folder and we want to save the file in that folder, right? So that's why we created this create folder function, and we're going to give it the folder name, right? So this is, we'll create it if it doesn't exist, otherwise it'll get ignored, right? So there we go. Then what we want to do is we want to make sure that we actually create the full path. So I'm going to say const file path. Then what we want to do is, I'm actually going to probably grab path.join from up here now that I think about it. So this actually is exactly what we want to do right here. We want to do path.join, grab the directory, and then add the folder name to it. But then what we want to do is when we saw path.join, it seems like they allowed us to actually add multiple kind of things. And this path.join effectively adds that slash in there for us. So I guess really it's kind of doing the separator thing for us behind the scenes, depending on the operating system you're on. So what I want to do is here maybe add stats.txt. So I'm saying create a file in the current folder with the folder name that we gave it, and then give it a stats.txt name at the end. And that's the end of the file path. So it's going to be something, /mu /stats.txt, or /Pikachu/stats.txt. Then we can use that write file that we just looked at. We can do fs.write file, but this is a promise. So technically what we should do is await this. So we actually pause the function here, await.write file, and we want to write that file path. And the stats, we want to do the, stats string is what we want to write to the file. Okay, so we're saying there's quite a lot here, right? You can see this is why this is kind of complicated. We're building up a string, which is this one. then what we're doing is creating a folder, which we saw previously. In this case, it'll be, for example, so we haven't done this yet, but for example, if I put this in here, Mewtwo, if I change how I call this function, I'm calling Mewtwo. So I'm going to say, create a folder called Mewtwo. I don't have a folder called Mewtwo, right? But create it for me. Then create this path, right? So in the current folder, Mewtwo, and then stats.txt, and then save that string as a file to that path as a text file. So let's try this out. I'm going to clear my console. I'm going to run this. Fingers crossed. So of course we get an error. I didn't code this correctly, even though I literally have the code. So you can see this is not a trivial thing. No such file or directory. Interesting. So why is that? Well, it created the directory. Oh, I see. So I think I see the error here. This is extremely tricky. And this is actually good that this came up, because this is a common issue when working with asynchronous code. So it looks like it should work, right? Because it actually created our folder here, and then it's trying to create the file. But what's happening is, since this is an asynchronous function right here, create folder, we're not actually waiting for the folder to be created before we try to come here, right? So we're actually in an async function. We're not telling it to pause here. So we're not saying, hey, wait for the folder to be created first and then create the file, assuming the folder exists. So we actually need to tell it to pause here. We want to await, create the folder, and then try to create the file. So let's try this out. I hope that's the bug. Pretty sure that's what it is. There we go. Okay, so it looks like we actually had something run. Oh, we got, okay, awesome. So stats.txt is in there, perfect. Let's try this. If I delete this file and I try to run this again, will it create the folder and the file? There we go. Okay, perfect. So both the file and the folder are created correctly in there. Beautiful. So definitely some tricky stuff there, right? When you're working with kind of file I/O, like input output, there's a lot of stuff that you have to think about, right? Like, is it created? Is it not created? Do I actually overwrite it? What if, all the data is not there, all that kind of stuff, which folders you're created in, or directory and structure to create it in. There's a lot going on, even in such a simple function of saving the stats. Definitely a lot happening. I'm going to get rid of this console log for now, just so that we don't have random console logs going out as we run this code later on. And for now, we actually are done with the Pokemon stats. Perfect. So we have create folder, and we have grab Pokemon stats. Now, this again is not fetching the Pokemon stats. This is just grabbing the Pokemon stats from the object that's been fetched previously. So just keep that in mind as well. So let's go back to our kind of structure here. We have fetch the stats. We've done this part over here. We want to now fetch the artwork and the sprites and save that image, and then we're close to being done. All right. So let's go ahead and start doing that. I'm going to do the artwork first, because that's actually a little bit easier. I'm going to comment this one out here. I'm going to say const save Pokemon artwork. This is going to be an async function. I'm going to structure this the same way. I'm going to say folder name, and then I'm going to say Pokemon, and instead of stats object, let's just say sprites object. All right, there we go. Cool. So what is the goal of this function? This function is meant to save the artwork to the disk. So we're going to assume that inside of here, we actually have the sprites object, but we don't necessarily have the URL for the Pokemon. So now is where I'm going to show you where we can actually start mixing concerns. Is this a good thing? I don't know. I probably would actually split this up further. I just want to show this to you purposefully so you can see the difference between this function, which has no fetching going on and is called save Pokemon stats, and what would happen if we tried to combine concepts, specifically fetching things and saving things in one function. Now, which one you like is definitely sometimes a bit of preference, but sometimes it really helps to split things up. But it's hard to picture this until you actually see examples, hence why I'm going to show you the opposite example. So again, I'm going to still assume that we have the Pokemon object first, because we still need to do a couple things. Let's take a look at our Pokemon API for this. So we want the artwork. So that's inside sprites. Maybe I'll make this a bit bigger. And inside of sprites, we have all of these artworks, or sprites, I should say, which are just regular sprites. So we don't want those. We have this other key, which has Dream World and Home and official artwork. And what we want is in here, official artwork front default. Okay, So let's assume we're going to get this sprites object. So what I want to then do is I want to actually do console.log. I want to grab the Pokemon sprites object. And inside of there, I want to go to official artwork. So this is going to be official-artwork. We can't use dot for this because of the dash. And then dot front underscore default. I want to see if this, actually I'm going to say const URL is equal to that. Okay, that way I can actually just log this out and use it later. Okay, let's see if this works. So I'm going to call save Pokemon artwork. I'll just give it a fake name for now. Let's just say Mew. And then I'm going to give it the Pokemon object dot sprites because I want to pass it this sprites object where then it can narrow it down to grab this artwork from. I could have done this another way and just given it the whole object, just a preference thing, but let's see what actually happens here. So I run node saving.js, I get an error, cannot read property front default of undefined. Okay, so I messed something up here. And my Pokemon sprites object, and then inside of there, I'm trying to grab official artwork. Okay, I think I did that wrong. Oh, it's an other.official artwork. Okay, so it's other, so other.official artwork. Or sorry, other and then official artwork and then dot front default. So we can't use dot for this again because of the slap and the dash in there. So let's try this. Okay, great. So this actually works, right? So if I try to grab this and then I come and open a new tab and I paste it in here, there's our friend Mewtwo, right? That's pretty cool. So that's official artwork for Mewtwo. Now the question is, how do we grab this, right? This is a URL, right? This is just a URL. Like this is not the actual image itself, right? So in order to actually fetch this image, we need to run a fetch request, right? So let's just import fetch for now and kind of take it from there. So I'm going to say import fetch from node-fetch. All right. Then I'm going to say const response is equal to await fetch this URL, okay? Then I'm going to have a response. And in that response is going to be a body that is going to be not JSON, but it's going to be a PNG, right? Because we're fetching a PNG URL. This is no longer JSON. So we saw in the exercises for fetch that to do this, we need to turn this into a buffer. So I'm going to say const array buffer is equal to await response dot array buffer. So let's just quickly Google for this because I feel like it's useful. So we're going to say node save buffer to file. Writing files in Node.js. Let's see this here. Something, write file. Write buffer. Okay. New buffer. Interesting. I think I remember seeing this somewhere else. I'm looking for something specifically where I remember seeing it before. I tested a bunch of these and it didn't work. Binary into a file. This is pretty old. Oh my goodness, look at that binary data. New buffer. We kind of want something like this. That might actually work. But let's see. Let's just look at another website, for example. This one right here. There we go. Buffer from. So this is actually what we want to do right here, right? So this is another blog. We have our array, buffer.from, and then the buffer, and then we can write it to our file. So what we want to then do is actually save that buffer to the file. So I want to say await fs.write file. And for now, I'm just going to give this a hard-coded name. Okay, I'm just going to say artwork.png. Okay, and I want to save buffer.from of this array buffer. All right, so let's see if this actually works. So I'm going to run this node saving.js. There we go. I have an artwork.png in here. I open it up and it's Mew, or Mewtwo in this case. All right, great. So that worked, but this is not ideal because this is in the wrong folder and all that kind of stuff. But at least proof of concept, we actually got this working. So that's pretty awesome. So what we want to do is we want to actually create the folder first, or try to create the folder, very similar to what we did here. So I'm just going to kind of grab this code here. I'm going to say await create folder, and I'm going to create the folder name. Just in case it doesn't exist here, I'll put this on a separate line just so we can do the fetching first and the writing files later. And then we want to save this image. Now, when I thought about this, this is another thing that's going to be useful as you work on projects is like, do I need to do this image? Do I have to basically do this stuff later on, right? And the answer is probably, right? Because we're going to be doing sprite saving. So I don't actually want to keep typing this. I'd rather just type it once and then not have to type it again. So I'm going to create up here another file or another function. Sorry, I'm going to call this save image file. It's going to be an async function. It needs to know a couple things. It needs to know the file path and it needs to know an array buffer, for example. Now you will get better at this as you go, what these parameters are that you need for the functions. And you can design this however you want. I specifically designed it in this way for this specific use case. There's probably other ways or better ways, frankly, than this. This is just one example. I want to be able to pass this function a path and then the buffer and just have it do its thing and save the file. So I'm actually going to copy this and I'm going to put it in here. Okay. And now this is no longer kind of the artwork.png. This is the file path. And now file or buffer from array buffer is actually going to work. Right. So now this, it seems kind of silly, this refactor, right? But it's quite useful. Okay, so let's kind of use this now, right? Save image file. Now, arguably, we can do all this file path stuff in there as well. So I'll leave it up to you whether you want to put that, abstract it into that save function or not. But for now, I'm just going to say save image file, and I need to give it a file path. And I also need to await this just in case something else is relying on this being saved. So let's create that file path. I'm going to say const file path is equal to, I'm going to do path.join again. And in here, so this is pretty repetitive code. I don't really like this. I feel like this probably would be good to put in a function, just to get your function senses tingling here. Folder name, and this is going to be called artwork.png. Okay, and in here I want to call this file path. And the data I want to save is, now I don't have to do this array buffer from stuff in this function because it's already done in the save image file function, right? So I can say array buffer, which is what I created here from the response directly. So the way that we read this is, what's the URL, right? I'm going to get rid of this console log. What's the URL that we want to go fetch? Then once we fetched it, what do we need from that? In this case, we want the array buffer, which is the image. Then what we want to do to save this is create a folder, which we've done before, create the path, which we've done before, and then save that image file to our disk. Now, the more I see this repetition here, the more kind of anxious I get in the sense of like, oh, I don't really like this. I probably should put this in a function or figure out a better way to actually approach this so I'm not repeating this code everywhere. So as you write these more, the more you'll feel those, and the more you see these things, the more you'll think about how you can refactor this code to be a little bit cleaner. But we'll leave it this for now. So hopefully this actually works. So in this case, I want to save this as mu2. And if I run this, and look at that. All right, awesome. I get artwork.png now inside of my mu2 folder, even though it already existed, right? That's pretty awesome. Let's try mu. I'm gonna change mu here, and then I change mu to be fetched over here, which we'll work on later from our actual CLI. I'm gonna run that. Oh, that didn't really work. Right? So I get no such file or directory trying to create mu artwork.png. So probably an async issue here again. Let's try to figure out where that's happening. So save image file right there. File path, await create folder. So the create folder should be done over here. I can see mu was created. I'm going to see if I can create this one more time. Is it the folder that's the issue? Yeah, it's the folder that's kind of the issue here. Okay, so if I open this, I should see mu. There's mu. So for some reason, our when we're saving the Pokemon artwork, the file is not, or the folder is not being created before we try to save. So save image file, we're giving it the file path, and then we're giving it the array buffer. Save image file takes the file path. It's going to do fs.write file path buffer from that. Interesting. So I don't actually see immediately what the issue is here because we're awaiting this. So that's kind of interesting. I just want to see that error one more time. I delete this mu, then I run this one more time. Make sure I save this file, run it one more time. And okay, so it actually worked this time. Confusion. What is happening? Is it because I had a mu file? I don't think I had a mu file. I'll delete that one more time just to make sure. I'm going to try this one more time. And it works, question mark. Okay, and you try one more time. Okay, maybe that was just me not saving my file. I actually don't remember what that was. It's a good thing to try this a few times. This is kind of the trial and error that happens as you're building these things. So it's not just you, it's everyone. Perfect, so that actually seems to work. Wonderful. So we have a way to save the artwork, and we have a way to save the stats. Now the last part is how do we save the actual sprites? So let's take a look at that. Pokemon API, sprites. We have back default, back female, shiny, shiny female, front shiny, etc. Right? So in order to do this, what we wanted to do was to create a bunch of files that had these as a name and then basically .png, right? So I had like back default.png, right? And I could have all of those listed out, assuming that they had that URL here. So very similar to the artwork, we want to fetch this, right? So if I actually pull this up, we can see that this is Mew's back, right? Or Mewtwo's back. So we want to do that same process of fetching the artwork, but for each of these sprites. So let's go ahead and code that out. So I'm going to say const. I'm going to call this save Pokemon sprites. And hopefully you can see there's some redundant code here. So maybe I didn't do this as well as I could have, right? And I can actually refactor this. So if you want to do that, definitely go ahead. This is kind of like my first or second pass at this code. So you definitely can clean this up quite a bit if you were to spend some time doing this. But the main thing is to get it working first. All right, so let's assume that we get this sprites object. So let's go with const. What do we want to do first? Actually, let's do a loop. Let's do for const sprite of. And what I want to do is I want to actually look at each of these key value pairs. I want to look at each of these. Object.entries, which gives us the key and the value, Pokemon sprites object. Okay. And I want to do console.log of that sprite. All right, so let's get rid of this one, and we'll change this one to save Pokemon sprites instead. All right, let's see what we get. Oops, I'm gonna make sure you can actually see that. Not that there's much to see, but you can see that we actually get back all of these different things. All right, so that's quite a lot. So if we think about this, let's go back here. We get back pretty much everything in here, including other and versions. So we don't want other and we don't want versions. In fact, what I actually want to do here is maybe I'm going to be fancy here. I'm going to use the destructuring syntax. We're getting back keys and values, right? As you can see, these are all arrays, and each arrays is a key followed by a value. So this is the key back default followed by back default's value, right? This is the key, where is it? Key official artwork. Oh, that's not a good one. This is the key front shiny with front shiny's value. All right, this is the key other followed by this huge object, which is the entire other thing. So I'm going to say for each key, and then for the URL, which is the second thing that I'm interested in. Okay, I'm going to console log out those keys just to see what we get first. And we get back all the keys, back default, back female, back shiny, etc., etc. But we also get others and versions. So we don't actually want that in this case because we just are interested in these 4 to 8 right here. Okay, so let's do this. We're going to say if the key is equal to, actually let's change this from key to, let's just go with name for now, like file name kind of thing, just so it's a bit nicer wording, is equal to other, or the name is equal to, what was it, versions, right? Then what do we want to do? We want to ignore those. So we can actually use this keyword continue, which skips everything after here. Like all this stuff gets skipped in a continue, and we just move to the next iteration of this loop. All right, so we can now see that we're only going to get logged out by, where is it, console.log key. This is console.log name now. All these errors as we're developing. We're going to get back only those names for those keys that are not other and that are not versions. All right. Wonderful. So quite a lot going on there. Now, here is something I want to introduce again as a new concept because that's the point of these videos as well. What we could do is we could save these one at a time. Every time we come in here, we could fetch that URL. So for example, if I save the URL in here as well, we can see that each of these has their URL, right? So this is the back default URL. There's no URL for back female. There's a back shiny URL. And we can grab each of those, right? In fact, what we should also do is if there is, I'm skipping around here, if there is no URL, right? Or if URL is equal to null, we can do this in two ways. If there's no URL, then we also want to continue. We don't want to show those ones. So I actually want to get rid of this one. I want to get rid of this one. I want to get rid of this one and this final one, right? So let me run this, see if that worked. And there we go, right? Now, if this particular Pokemon doesn't have those URLs, we can just skip it and not try to fetch something that doesn't exist. Okay, so what I was saying earlier though is we have, in this case, 4 URLs. We could potentially have 8 URLs. It's totally valid to fetch these one at a time. So inside of here, we could say like fetch the image, and then we could do like save the image, right? And this is totally valid. In fact, this is how I would expect you to do it the first time. But you can probably imagine that these URLs or the responses from these URLs do not rely on each other. So they're totally independent. So I don't actually need to wait for this one to come back before I can use this one. Similarly, I don't actually need to wait for this one to come back before I can save this one or fetch this one or fetch this one, right? They're all totally independent. So a smarter way to approach this would be just to ask for all of them at once and then wait for all of them to come back at once. So instead of, if these each took like 1 second, for example, instead of this taking like 4 to 8 seconds, it would just take 1 second, right? Because it would take the longest fetch, basically. So the way that we do that was with promise.all. So I'm just going to show you how to actually approach that. And this is totally not what you have to do. It just makes this program run a little bit faster. So I'm going to create a let sprite promises equal an array here. I'm going to say let sprite names is equal to an array as well. And I'll show you why we need both of these, because as I was developing this, I just wanted an easy way to keep track of both of these. So if we get past other versions and no URL, we want to push to Sprites promises a fetch request that is going to grab that URL, but we don't want to wait for it. We just want to push the promise, which is pending, to that promise array. So let's just see how that works. So we're going to say sprite promises dot push, and we're going to push fetch the URL, which is this URL, right? Which is each of these. So we're going to fetch that. But in here, we can actually be fancy if we really want to. And we can say dot then. And inside of the dot then, we're going to get back the response. And we want to grab the response dot array buffer. And I'm using the short form function syntax. So this is actually being returned. So what this is saying, this looks crazy. And this is why I want to be really explicit with what I'm saying here. I'm saying do a fetch request to this URL. When it comes back, what I want you to do is immediately turn it into an array buffer. But this is also a promise. So we have to do a dot then on it, right? Now I'm going to push this entire promise, right? Both parts of these onto this promises array. And then I can use promise.all later to wait for all of those promises to finish at the same time. Okay. Now we could also split this up into 2 steps. We could have done this in 1 step and then done the array buffering in another step. I'm just going to show you how you can be a bit fancy if you want and do this all in 1 step, because I'm sure you'd be curious as to how to optimize this and speed it up. And we're going to see many examples of this as we progress with backend and front-end development. Okay, so if you get confused about this, please post in the comments and I would love to explain it further. But definitely kind of take a look at this and try to figure out what's happening as you're building this project. We also want to push to sprite names the name of the Pokemon. And the reason I wanted to do this was, the name of the Pokemon, the name of the key. So back shiny, back default, front shiny, right? Because I want to be able to remember the indices for each of these. So the first item in Sprites promises is going to be the first item in sprite names. Second item in sprite promises, the second item in sprite names, right? So I'll show you what I mean in a second. So what we're going to have at the end of this loop is a list of promises that are that have this array buffer already completed. or sorry, they're pending. They're about to be completed, right? And we have a list of sprite names with just these names inside of it. So what we can then do is we can say sprite promises. Once we want to complete all these, we can say promise.all, and we can say take. This is a bit confusing because I'm using the same name just so I don't create too many variables here. But I'm saying please wait for all of the promises to come back. I want you to wait for all of them to resolve. I want for all of them to now be in this state, the array buffer state. Not this state right here, which is just the body. I want them to actually be resolved as array buffers. And now I'm going to have 4 to 8 array buffers in here in the correct order. Okay. So this is going to be an array of the promises in the correct order. Then what I want to do is I'm going to make sure I create my folder. And once I've created my folder, I'm going to create a loop. So I'm going to say for let I equal 0 for my index, I is less than sprite promises.length. And I know this is probably the hardest part of this, so bear with me as we code this out together and I'll explain it. We're going to create our file path. And this is going to be path.join. Let me just grab it from up here so I'm not copying too much. So path.join right here. And we want to grab the current working directory. We want to do the folder name. And then we also want to do a template string in here. So this is no longer artwork.png. This is going to be, where is it? Sprite names. I'm going to put this on separate lines actually, just so you can actually really see what this looks like. There we go. So just so you can see a bit clearer, right? These are 3 arguments to this path.join function. We're grabbing the directory, we're grabbing the folder name, and then the actual file name itself, which is sprite names, which is our array at the index that we're currently looking at, .png. Okay. Perfect. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So once we have that actually working, now we can actually use this path to save the file. Okay, and the reason we need this sprite name again is just to be clear, back default, back shiny, front default, front shiny. Okay, we want to use those names to create these PNG files, and since we save them in the same order as the promises, we can actually do this loop to create this. There's other ways to do this. I just think that based on the tools that we have, this is probably the easiest way to do it. The easiest way, quote unquote. All right, then what we want to do is we want to do an await. And we're going to say image file, or save image file. And this await is going to pause, but it's going to be quite quick relative to actually fetching something over the internet. And we want to do a file path. And what we want to save to here is that array buffer, which also, like we're grabbing sprite names in the correct order, is going to be sprite promises, which is now an array of array buffers at index I. I'm also going to show you what this looks like. So I'm going to do a console log. I'm going to say saved, and I'll do file path, just so we can see exactly the path that's being generated and eventually the array buffer for that promise that was fetched, which is going to be either the back default one, the back shiny, front default, or front shiny, or the other 4 for the female versions saved to their correct spots. Now, if you look at this function and you're just like, oh my gosh, Nader, what on earth is this? Why would you make us do this, right? And that's kind of the point, right? I want you to really feel a little bit of the struggle, because this is not meant to be an easy task. This is meant to be something that really tests what it's like to build something like this in the real world. In the real world, when we're building these apps, we're always going to be smashing into errors, hitting our head against the wall, going from one error to the next error, maybe taking a break, getting frustrated, and coming back, right? That's how it's going to work. And there's going to be many, many ways to do something. The internet's not always going to have the answer. We're going to have to mix and match different things and our knowledge and concepts that we've learned so far together. All right, so enough of that. Let's see if this actually works. So I'm going to say save Pokemon sprites with Mew and the sprites object, and let's see what we get. All right, so it's saying it saved all of these files. That's pretty cool. And I saw a bunch of stuff pop up here, right? So we have our artwork from before, but then we have really, really small Mew here. Oops, I think I zoomed in way too far. My screen is freaking out now, but I'll zoom back out there. And we have our back shiny, front default, front shiny, right? That's pretty awesome. Pretty darn cool. Okay, so that's saving the Pokemon. Now, the last thing that we really need to do is pull this all together. So we have all this working. We have all this working. We just need to do this last part to really wrap this up. All right, so moment of truth, let's figure this out. This is kind of the home stretch. We want to grab from prompts all of these options, right? And then what we want to do is, based on these options, we want to figure out whether we need to save stats.txt or the different PNG files for sprites or the artwork. Okay, so from our previous video, we saw that we basically took this options thing, options object, so it has an options key on it, and that's going to tell us the options that they picked. So let's actually see what that looks like. So I'm going to bring back this prompt user here. I'm going to run node prompts.js. I'm going to say I want Pikachu. Then I'm going to choose all these options. I'm going to choose all of them for now. I want to see what comes back. And I want to say no. So it looks like we get back in this dot options an array. So the array has stats, sprites, and artwork in it. Okay, so let's think about this. We want to check if they chose stats, sprites, or artwork. That's the goal. So let's come back here, and in our savings, I'm going to create another file or another function. Sorry. This was a bit tricky for me because I wasn't really sure where to put this function, and it felt a bit out of place. So definitely modify this as you need it. I did this kind of in 1 or 2 passes. So try to figure out where fits best for you. I'm just going to put it here for now so I don't get too lost with my notes here. So I'm going to say const parse options. I'm going to create a function whose job is literally just to take that options right here, parse it, and then decide to call either of these 3 functions if it has that key in it. Now, in here, this is going to be an async function. It's going to need to take that Pokemon object, which is the actual fetched Pokemon object, which is right here. So our Pokemon JSON, I should really say Pokemon JSON, but let's just go with Pokemon object to match these objects here. And I'm going to say an options object. Okay. So I'm just going to pull out that options key. As you can see here, we grabbed options. Where was it? Right here. So I don't want to have to type dot options every time. So I'm going to say const options is equal to options object dot options, just so I can get this array, right? So that's this array right here. Then I want to grab the Pokemon name. So I'm going to say const Pokemon name is equal to Pokemon object dot name. And I know that because if I look at the API that comes back, that's right here. That's this key right here. It's in the top level of this object, and its key is name, and we get back the actual name of the Pokemon. All right. So we could have got this in a few other ways. We could have got it from the prompt, but since it's in the Pokemon object, let's just kind of make this simpler and grab it directly from in here. Okay. So now what we want to do is basically wrap this all together. We want to check, did you want to check for stats? Did you want to check for sprites? Did you want to check for artwork? Right? So we're going to say if the options, which is the array, and we want to check if this array has stats in it or has sprites in it or has artwork in it, right? So I'm going to just Google for this real quick. I'm going to say JS array contains, or is it includes? I always forget. This includes. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to say if options dot includes, just spell that correctly, stats. Make sure you have the capitalization correctly if you follow what I have with my caps for my first letter. So if they want stats, what do we want to do? We want to go out and save the Pokemon stats. Right? Now you can kind of hopefully see why it's so useful to split up these functions. Because now we don't have to think about it at that low level. We can just be like, okay, they wanted stats. We have something to save the stats. So save Pokemon stats. It just needs to know a folder name. So the folder name is the Pokemon name, right? That's why we grab the Pokemon name. So we can just say Mew or Pikachu. And then inside of the Pokemon object, which is that big outer JSON object, right? This one right here, sorry, where is it? This whole object. For stats, we want to pass in the stats object, right? Which was right here. We wanted to pass in this stats object because that's what we're using to loop through. So in here, I want to say Pokemon objects.stats. And that's it. This has already been done by us, right? The logic for this is already all in here. As long as we give it the right object and the right name, we are done with that. And now we can do this a few times. I'm going to say if they ask. I'm not going to do an else if. I'm going to do another if because they can choose multiple of these, right? So technically they can choose all three. So if I say now if they include sprites, well, what do I want to do? Well, I'm going to say await, save Pokemon sprites this time, Pokemon name for the folder name. And for the sprites object, well, sprites object is located here. It's .sprites. It's not just .stats like the stats object. So I'm going to say .sprites. Okay. I'm getting too excited. I'm moving my mouse around here. Now if I say if options.includes, and the final one is going to be artwork, right? So if they ask for the artwork, then I'm going to do await, save Pokemon artwork. And in here, I'm going to do Pokemon name. And this is the same thing, Pokemon object.sprites is what we asked it for. We could have changed this, but we left it to keep it very similar to the other function. And that's it, right? So this bunch of code, this function right here, is sole job, as long as we give it the correct JSON Pokemon object and the options object, which is this one right here, which has these stats and sprites and artwork in it, it's going to figure out where to direct those requests. Is it going to go to this function, or this function, or all three, or a mix of them, right? So what I want to then do is I want to export this. I'm going to say export parse options. This is because we're in an ES module, we can export that out. All right, we no longer need fetch Pokemon in here, so we can get rid of that. We just need these other ones. I'm also going to get rid of these comments in here. And I'm also going to get rid of this comment here. All right, and I'm also going to get rid of this Pokemon object right here. There we go. So if you look at this file, it's pretty clean. We have a whole bunch of functions, and then we're exporting one of them, which ends up using these other ones inside of it. So it's like this rabbit hole of functions calling other functions, but each one is just doing its own job. Except we cheated a little bit. Some of these are doing some fetching, so you can refactor those if you want. Now, if we don't need fetch anymore, we can get rid of it from here. We don't need prompt user in our prompts file either, so we can get rid of that. And that's pretty much it. So now what do we want to do? We want to import what we just exported from savings, parse options. So let's do parse options from /saving, which is what I called my file. And this should be .js. Okay. And if we scroll down to our last function that we had here, prompt user, we're grabbing the Pokemon JSON, get rid of this console log. We're grabbing the options, going to get rid of that console log. And now we want to what? We want to parse those options, right? So if I take parse options, which I just imported, it's going to take the Pokemon object, which is the JSON, Pokemon JSON, right? And once I have that, then now only thing left to pass it is that Pokemon options object, which is this one, right? So I'm grabbing the Pokemon JSON from the API, which is that big object. I'm grabbing the options, which is from inquire, which is from that prompt, which has this in it. And I'm passing those both to this function that we just wrote together that is going to figure out what to do and where to direct all of those stats, sprites, or artwork. And that's going to happen right after right after we fetch, right after we ask for the options. I'm also going to do an await here because I want to pause the function. I don't want to ask for keep going right away. I made this mistake and I had a bug in my code where it would kind of come down to this line right before it had a chance to actually finish. So since these are all async functions, we want to actually block and make sure that these happen in order and we don't move to the next step until this is complete. So we're going to await that, and that has its own awaits inside of it as well. Then once we're done all that and all the saving is complete, we can ask if the user wants to continue. Now, same thing in here. We can export our prompt user. And if I go to create another file, what I can do is basically create a file that literally just imports this. And I called that Pokemon Downloader. So I'll just go with the same name, Pokemon-Downloader, downloader.js. And inside of here, I can import my prompt user from /prompts.js, right? That's in the folder prompts.js file. I'm going to just do console.log, and in here, I think I'll put, just for fun, I'll just put a little banner, and I'll say like -- Pokemon Downloader, -- or something like that, right? And I literally just need to call this function. That's all I need to do, right? Because all of our logic is in these files over here, right? We have prompt Pokemon, we have prompt for download info, prompt to continue, we got fetch Pokemon, prompt the user, which puts everything together. This is reliant on everything from in here, mainly this one, which is also itself reliant on all these functions, right? So now if you look at these files, this is relatively split up and quite clean, right? Let's test this out and see if it actually works. I'm going to run node, our new file, Pokemon Downloader.js. Okay, what Pokemon do you want? Let's go with Charmander, which I haven't done yet, right? And I press enter. What do you want for Charmander? I'm going to choose all of Charmander's information. And of course, I get an error because I have a spelling mistake in my, so anticlimactic, but so typical. This is inside of one of my functions right here. This is, I think you can't see this, but it's telling me it's inside of my prompts.js file right here. It's saying the options.includes was spelled wrong, right? So if I look for where that was, that is options.includes right here. So that's the error. You're probably laughing at me while I'm doing this, but that's fantastic. Let's try that one more time. Pokemon Downloader. I want Charmander, and I want all of Charmander's information. And look at that, right? All of that information was saved. Do I want to search for another Pokemon? Well, before I do that, I'm going to check Charmander. There we go. Artwork. Oh, amazing. Bat default, back shiny, right? All those are in there. Stats, those are in there. I'm going to search for another Pokemon. Let's go with Squirtle. And it's probably going off my screen, but I'm going to pick all of Squirtle's information. All that gets saved. And then now I have another file here somewhere, folder Squirtle, artwork. Oh my goodness, look at that. That's how I feel. I'm good. I'm done. I need a break from this. But I also feel amazing because this was a lot of fun to build, right? So the stats here for our Squirtle are a bit different, as you can see, and then we have the different front default and back default and etc. Okay, so I know that this was a long video. But I really had no other way apart from splitting this up even further, and I didn't want to do that because I have some other topics I'd like to get with you too. But I hope that was useful, right? If you think about this project, like we really did a lot. There was a lot of requirements. There's all this crazy stuff happening behind the scenes. We had to break it down to all these different pieces, and each of those pieces we broke into further pieces, right? But when you're thinking of a project, this is really what you need to do. You need to take something huge and break it down to smaller and smaller pieces. You're going to have a lot of errors along the way. You're going to have a lot of Googling along the way. You're going to just be totally confused most of the time as you start learning some of these features until they become more routine. And even then, you're going to run into a lot of errors. While I was building this myself, I ran into a bunch of errors as well, and I had to Google around and fix them. And since I've Googled a lot, I know what to Google for a little bit faster than I used to be able to. So the process gets sped up as you get better, but it's still there. All right. The main thing is you know the process and how you approach a problem and break it down into these pieces and not give up as you run into these errors. So I hope you found that useful. Again, apologies for it being a little bit long. I'm super excited that this is finally done. So this is effectively the capstone for this second part of the JavaScript series. What we're going to do in the next part of the series, I really wanted to add kind of a cap off the series with some of the more advanced concepts, since I really wanted to go in depth with JavaScript. And those are things like prototypes and closures and scope and all these fancy, crazy words that we're going to have to get to together to really go in depth and dig into JavaScript itself, so that once we start building actual backends, start building front ends, start moving to all types of other technologies using JavaScript, we have a really, really solid foundation. So I hope you appreciated this video. If you did, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. What we're going to do in the next video is we're going to start going into deeper parts of JavaScript and start the final and third part of this series before we move on to front-end and back-end technologies. If there are topics you want me to cover as well in there, definitely let me know. But I can't wait to get to those. I'll see you in that video.